For 3 weeks now, Hong Kong has been synonymous with protests. Ugly clashes have been witnessed in several parts as protesters and police personnel faced off. Today marked the first time the protesters stormed the Legislature building, the heart of the government of Hong Kong. A sea of yellow helmets took over as tens of thousands clogged the streets. Windows were smashed, metal fences were torn apart. The escalation in tempers comes on the anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. Overall, the protest movement has targeted a proposed law. It's called the Extradition Bill or the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance Bill. If implemented, it would have allowed suspects to be extradited to the Chinese mainland to face trial. Protesters say the legislation curtails their basic human rights. The fear is that critics of China in Hong Kong could potentially be extradited to the mainland to face trial in courts controlled by the Communist Party. What's more, it won't be limited to locals. Critics fear even foreigners and tourists could be picked up and sent to the mainland under this proposed law. But the government maintains that there is no reason to worry and that only people accused of serious and criminal offences would be extradited. The bill was suspended following the wide-scale protests, but it was not scrapped. And that is the contentious point, something that the demonstrators have been pushing for. They also want the Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam to step down. Protests have become common in Hong Kong. In 2014, remember, there was the Umbrella Revolution. It mobilized people against proposed electoral reforms. People used yellow umbrellas to protect themselves from pepper spray. The protests ended only after a crackdown by authorities. In 2003, a new law sought to criminalize sedition and subversion against China. There were protests then too. They forced the Hong Kong government to withdraw the legislation. But what's happening this year, now, is being called the biggest demonstration ever. Earlier today, a flag-raising ceremony was organized to mark the city's handover from Great Britain to China 22 years ago, 1997. Large groups of protesters rallied outside the Hong Kong Convention Centre, where the ceremony was taking place. Police resorted to using pepper spray and batons against anti-government protesters who had taken over highways and arterial roads. So what is happening in Hong Kong? We'll try to make sense of it, but this comes at a very important time. 1st July 2019 marks 22 years since Hong Kong was handed over to Chinese rule by Britain. The arrangement came to be called a one country, two systems formula. It guaranteed Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms, including an independent justice system. Our next report traces the history of Hong Kong.
Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty on 1st July 1997 after 155 years of British rule. This transfer of sovereignty is known commonly as the handover, when the then Chinese President Jiang Zemin, the last colonial governor Chris Patten, Prince Charles and the then Prime Minister Tony Blair attended the ceremony. Hong Kong residents headed to the polls in May 1998, where they voted in the city's first election for its legislature under Chinese rule. Democrats celebrated a strong victory, winning as many as 14 seats in the new 60-member Legislative Council, or LEGCO. On 1st July 2003, thousands of protesters took to the streets to denounce the city government's planned anti-subversion law. Brandishing banners, umbrellas and fans, many of the people dressed in black to mourn what they said was the demise of rights and freedoms in one of the world's key financial centers. Critics of the law, commonly known in Hong Kong as Article 23, said that it posed the biggest threat to basic rights in the former British colony. Shortly after the demonstration, the bill was shelved. On 10th March 2005, Tung Chee-hwa, the first chief executive after the handover, resigned citing health reasons. His unpopular leadership had sparked massive pro-democracy protests. The year 2009 saw the largest turnout at Hong Kong's annual Tiananmen Candlelight Vigil on 4th June. An estimated 150,000 people showed up at a downtown park which turned into a speckled sea of flickering lights in remembrance of the pro-democracy demonstrators and students crushed by tanks and troops near Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989. China's legislature, the National People's Congress, declared on 31st August 2014 that any candidate for Hong Kong's leader would have to get majority backing from an election committee which was packed with pro-Beijing loyalists. Besides, there were other conditions that some in the city's opposition deemed fake China-style democracy. The conditions for a nomination effectively made it impossible for opposition figures to get on the ballot and proved a trigger for the 2014 protests. These protests were also known as the Umbrella Revolution, after the umbrellas that protesters used to fend off police pepper spray, tear gas and batons. The 79-day Occupy Central street demonstrations crippled parts of Hong Kong and were one of the boldest populist challenges to Beijing's Communist Party leaders in decades. The disappearance of 5 booksellers in July 2016 gave rise to more protests. A Hong Kong court jailed 3 leaders of the Chinese-ruled city's democracy movement for 6 to 8 months in August 2017, dealing a blow to the youth-led push for universal suffrage and prompting accusations of political interference. Joshua Wong and 2 others were sentenced in 2016 for unlawful assembly. Joshua, who has become the face of Hong Kong's push for full democracy, walked free from prison on the 17th of June this year.
Hong Kong people will not keep silence under the suppression of President Xi and the Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Carrie Lam must step down.
On 23rd January, the Hong Kong government presented a controversial bill to lawmakers that prescribes jail terms of up to 3 years for disrespecting the Chinese national anthem, a move critics say raises fresh fears over freedom of expression in the city. And on 9th June, a million-strong gathering of protesters, according to the organizers, filled the streets of Hong Kong in a bid to thwart a proposed extradition law that would allow suspects to be sent to China for facing trial. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.